Imagine standing face to face with a person who looks exactly like you, someone who moves like you, speaks like you, and claims they are the original. What would you do? This is the twisted psychological game the ghost town of St. Elmo is playing with us. We might have physically made it back, but I'm convinced our shadows are still trapped in that darkness forever. Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of the Appalachian Void. October 13th, 2024. The air clinging to the rugged slopes of the Colorado Rockies was thin, biting, and carried a metallic scent that seemed to leak directly from the earth itself. 4 students from the University of Colorado Boulder, Ethan, Chloe, Leo, and Olivia, stepped out of their dust-caked Ford Raptor as it hissed to a halt in the center of St. Elmo. They were there for their senior seminar project, a documentary titled The Ghost of the Machine: Industrial Decay in the American West. St. Elmo was supposed to be the crown jewel of their footage, a perfectly preserved ghost town frozen in 1880. But as the truck door slammed shut, the sound didn't echo. It was swallowed instantly by a heavy, suffocating silence that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. Ethan, the group's director and primary cinematographer, slung his Blackmagic camera bag over his shoulder. He was a man of cold logic, a firm believer in optics and physics. Yet the way the vacant windows of the jaded wooden storefront stared back at him made his skin crawl. Chloe adjusted her denim jacket, her eyes scanning the horizon. For her, this wasn't just an academic exercise. Her great-grandfather had been a mucker in the Mary Murphy mine during the gold rush, and family lore whispered that he had left something behind in the dark, something more than his youth. Leo, the sound engineer, was already rigged with his shotgun mic and oversized headphones, his brow furrowed as he dialed in the gain. Olivia, the writer and researcher, clutched her notebook to her chest, her eyes darting toward the dilapidated structures of Main Street. "Welcome to the dead zone," Olivia whispered, her voice barely rising above the dry rustle of the mountain grass. At its peak, 2,000 people lived here. Now it's just us and the memories of 1,000 failed dreams. Ethan set his tripod on the dusty road. Memories make for good B-roll, Liv. Let's get the opening shot before the light shifts. But Leo didn't look convinced. "It's not the wind, it's a cadence." It sounds like a stamp mill, miles away but perfectly clear. They pushed forward toward the Mary Murphy mine, located 2 miles up a steep winding trail that hugged the mountainside. By the time they reached the adit, the main entrance, the sun had begun its descent, casting long, jagged shadows across the valley. The entrance was a jagged wound in the mountainside, reinforced by rotting timbers that groaned under the weight of the rock above. A draft of frigid air rushed out, carrying the stench of wet sulfur and decaying wood. "We shouldn't go too deep," Olivia said, her voice trembling. "The air quality is probably terrible." "We have the O2 sensors and the heavy-duty flashlights," Ethan replied, his professional ambition overriding his growing unease. "We need the interior shots of the vein tracks. 10 minutes in, 10 minutes out. The moment they stepped past the portal, the world changed. The ambient light of day died instantly, replaced by the harsh, narrow beams of their LED flashlights. The silence inside the mine was absolute, yet it felt crowded." Leo froze again. He stared at his digital recorder. "The levels are spiking, but there's no sound in the room. It's like the recorder is picking up a frequency we can't hear." Chloe walked toward the wall, her hand trembling as she touched the damp rock. "My grandfather's diary. He wrote about the quiet ones in the deep shafts. He said they didn't speak, they just vibrated." Suddenly, a loud metallic clack echoed from the tunnel ahead. It was the distinct sound of an iron ore car moving on rusted rails. They all spun their lights toward the sound. The tracks were empty, but a fresh set of grooves in the dust suggested something had just passed through. Olivia gasped, pointing her light at her own feet. A dark, wet handprint was visible on her hiking boot, perfectly formed, though no one had touched her. "We're leaving," Ethan said, his voice finally cracking. "Now." They turned to retreat, but the tunnel they had just walked through looked different. The timber supports seemed closer together, and a thick black fungus was pulsing on the ceiling, dripping a viscous fluid that smelled of copper. They began to jog, then run, their heavy breathing the only sound in the dark. But after several minutes, they didn't reach the exit. They reached a junction of 3 tunnels that Ethan didn't remember passing. "We're turned around," Leo panted, his headphones lopsided. "The compass is spinning. There's too much magnetite in here." Ethan pointed his light down the center tunnel. At the very edge of the beam, he saw a figure. It was a man in a tattered canvas coat, holding a rusted carbide lamp. The man didn't have a face, just a smooth, pale surface where features should be. He beckoned to them, a slow, jerky motion of his arm that looked like a marionette being pulled by strings. "Did you see that?" Ethan hissed, but when the others looked, the figure was gone. The paranoia began to set in like a physical weight. Olivia started weeping, claiming she could feel cold fingers brushing against the back of her neck. Chloe began reciting names of miners who had died in the 1920 collapse, as if she were reading them off a ledger only she could see. The air grew thick, tasting of old blood and spent matches. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward them, and the walls appeared to be weeping a dark, oily substance. "Look at the camera," Ethan shouted, trying to ground them in reality. "Look at the screen, it's just rock and dust. We are university students in a defunct mine. There are no ghosts." But even as he said it, his camera's monitor flickered. In the infrared view, he saw that Leo and Olivia were not alone. Behind them, dozens of transparent skeletal figures were huddled, their hollow eyes fixed on the heat signatures of the living. Ethan felt his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He didn't tell the others what he saw. He couldn't. They sprinted down the leftmost tunnel, driven by a primal urge to escape the tightening grip of the mountain. The ground beneath them turned into a slurry of mud and bone-white gravel. Just as their flashlights began to flicker, they burst through a set of heavy wooden doors and found themselves, impossibly, back in the center of St. Elmo. They stood in the middle of Main Street, gasping for air, the moonlight casting a silver glow over the ruins. But something was wrong. The town was no longer silent. From every building, a soft, discordant chanting rose into the night air. The windows of the Pacific Hotel were no longer dark. A pale, flickering light glowed from within, and shadows of people who didn't exist danced against the glass. Ethan fumbled for his keys and scrambled into the Raptor, the others piling in behind him. As he floored the engine and tore out of the ghost town, he looked into the rearview mirror. Standing in the middle of the road, perfectly still, were 4 figures. They were wearing the same clothes as Ethan, Chloe, Leo, and Olivia. The doubles didn't move. They just watched the truck disappear into the darkness, their faces devoid of any human expression. They had escaped the mine, but as the highway lights finally appeared in the distance, Ethan realized the rhythmic hum Leo had picked up earlier was now coming from inside his own chest. The first act of their nightmare had ended, but the mountain had already marked them. They were alive, but the Colorado silt was now in their veins, and the silence of St. Elmo was a sound they would never be able to unhear. Ethan's camera, sitting on the passenger seat, hummed to life on its own, recording the empty cabin in the dark, capturing the thin, white mist that was slowly beginning to coil around their feet. The tires screamed against the asphalt as Ethan pushed the Raptor far beyond the speed limit. The engine's roar, a desperate shield against the memory of the 4 silent figures they had left standing in the dust of St. Elmo. The high peaks of the Sawatch Range loomed like jagged teeth against the moonlit sky, and for a few miles the group allowed themselves the luxury of a frantic, adrenaline-fueled hope. But the relief was short-lived. As the truck crested a ridge that should have revealed the lights of Buena Vista, the headlights instead fell upon a familiar, weathered wooden sign. "Welcome to St. Elmo, population 0. Ethan slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding sideways in a cloud of grit. "That's impossible," he choked out, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "I've been driving south for 20 minutes. We should be at the highway." Leo, sitting in the back, didn't answer. He was staring at his digital audio recorder. The screen was flickering wildly, displaying timestamps from the year 1892, then 1923, then 2050. He pressed play on the last recorded file. From the speakers came the sound of their own voices, but it wasn't the conversation they were having now. It was a recording of them screaming in a place they hadn't reached yet. "The loop isn't just spatial, Ethan," Olivia whispered, her eyes wide and glassy. "It's psychological. The mind didn't let us go. It just expanded its borders." Desperate, Ethan pulled a U-turn and floored it in the opposite direction. They drove for 10 miles, then 15. The odometer spun frantically, yet the landscape refused to change. The same crooked pine tree, the same rusted ore bucket on the side of the road, and finally the same "Welcome to St. Elmo" sign appeared again. The truck's fuel gauge suddenly plummeted to empty, and the engine sputtered and died right in front of the town's old general store. The silence that followed was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against their eardrums. The temperature inside the cabin dropped until their breath came out in thick white plumes. Chloe, who had remained eerily still, reached for the door handle. "Don't," Ethan hissed. "We stay in the truck." "It doesn't matter where we stay," Chloe said, her voice sounding hollow as if she were speaking through a long pipe. "The interior and the exterior have merged. Look at the dashboard." Ethan looked. The plastic of the dashboard was beginning to crack, and from the crevices fine gold dust was leaking out, shimmering in the moonlight. The leather seats felt cold and damp, turning into the texture of raw, unrefined ore. They weren't in a truck anymore. The vehicle was being absorbed by the mountain's memory. Driven by a sudden claustrophobic panic, they scrambled out of the vehicle. The town of St. Elmo looked different now. The buildings weren't just old, they were pulsating. The wood grain on the walls moved like slow-motion ripples on water. As they stood in the street, they heard the sound of a bell, the old schoolhouse bell, tolling a slow, rhythmic funeral knell. "We have to find the source," Leo said, his voice trembling. "The recorder. The frequency is coming from the old town hall." They moved as a single unit, their flashlights cutting through a fog that had become so thick it felt like walking through cobwebs. When they reached the town hall, the doors swung open before they could touch them. Inside, the floorboards were covered in a foot of standing water that reflected not the ceiling, but the dark, jagged tunnels of the Mary Murphy mine. Every step they took sent ripples across the surface, and in those ripples they saw flashes of their own lives. Olivia saw the moment she decided to lie to her parents about this trip. Leo saw the face of the brother he hadn't spoken to in years. The mine was harvesting their regrets, turning their internal shadows into external threats. Suddenly, the walls of the town hall began to bleed a thick, dark substance that smelled of ozone and ancient earth. From the corners of the room, shadows detached themselves. These weren't the faceless miners from before, these shadows had their faces. A shadow Ethan stood by the window, miming the action of filming with a camera made of bone. A shadow Olivia sat in a corner, frantically writing in a notebook that bled ink like a wound. "They're replacing us," Olivia shrieked, clutching her head. "They're taking the parts of us that make us real." The death anxiety was a tangible force now, a cold hand tightening around their throats. They tried to run back to the door, but the exit was gone. In its place was a massive, vibrating wall of rock, the actual face of the Mary Murphy mine appearing miles away from where it should be. The mountain had physically manifested inside the town. Leo fell to his knees as his headphones exploded with a screeching feedback loop. He tore them off, but the sound continued, emanating from his own ears. "It's the crush," he screamed. "I can feel the weight of the mountain on my chest. I can't breathe." Ethan grabbed Leo, trying to haul him up, but his own legs felt like lead. He looked at his hands and saw that his skin was turning the color of weathered granite. They were becoming part of the landscape, statues of flesh in a gallery of stone. "The light!" Chloe shouted, pointing upward. In the center of the ceiling, a single antique mining lantern was hanging by a rusted chain. It flickered with a strange violet flame, the only thing in the room that felt other than the mountain. Chloe, driven by an ancestral instinct she couldn't explain, climbed onto a rotting table and reached for it. The moment her fingers brushed the cold iron of the lantern, the room erupted in a violent tremor. The floorboards buckled, and the water turned into a vortex of mud. The shadows of themselves let out a collective silent scream and vanished into the walls. "Hold on to me!" Ethan yelled over the roar of the shifting earth. They huddled together under the flickering violet light. The walls of the town hall began to peel away like wet paper, revealing not the town of St. Elmo, but the vast, terrifying emptiness of the Colorado night. They felt a sensation of falling, a sickening drop through layers of time and rock. When the world finally stopped shaking, they were back on the mountain trail just outside the Mary Murphy portal. The truck was parked a few yards away, its engine ticking as it cooled. The sun was gone, replaced by a bruised purple twilight. They were all alive. Their hearts were hammering, their lungs burning with the dry mountain air, but they were whole. However, the fear hadn't left them. It had merely settled. It was no longer a scream. It was a permanent hum in the marrow of their bones. Ethan looked at the others. Their faces were etched with a trauma that no therapist could ever touch. They had seen the machinery of the world break down, and they had realized that the reality they lived in was as thin as a coat of paint over a crumbling wall. "We're going," Ethan said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "We're going, and we're never looking back." As they piled into the truck, Leo noticed that his audio recorder had melted into a solid lump of plastic. Olivia's notebook was filled with pages of nothing but the word "stay," written in her own handwriting. And Chloe? Chloe sat in the front staring at the mine entrance with a look of profound, terrifying recognition. They drove away, and this time the sign said, "Leave St. Elmo." They hit the highway, the lights of civilization finally appearing like a row of distant candles. They had survived the second act of the mountain's play, but as Ethan glanced in the mirror, he saw that his eyes no longer reflected the light of the dashboard. They were as dark and deep as the shafts of the Mary Murphy, harboring a silence that would stay with him until the day he finally returned to the earth. The mountain hadn't killed them, but it had stolen the versions of them that knew how to feel safe. They were 4 survivors heading toward a world that would never look the same again, carrying a piece of St. Elmo's darkness in the hollow spaces of their souls. The second act was over, but the echo of the mountain sigh followed them home, a low-frequency vibration that promised they were never truly alone. The highway lights of Buena Vista finally flickered on the horizon, but for Ethan, Chloe, Leo, and Olivia, the transition back to the world of the living felt like a lie. They had reached the outskirts of a small gas station, the neon open sign buzzing with a hum that vibrated in sync with the phantom ringing in Leo's ears. Ethan pulled the Raptor to a stop under the fluorescent lights, the engine clicking as it died. They sat in a paralyzed silence, the hum of the heater the only thing tethering them to the present. "We made it," Olivia whispered, though she didn't move to open the door. She stared at her hands. They were stained with a dark, fine silt that refused to be rubbed off. Ethan looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror. His face was a mask of exhaustion, but deep within his pupils he saw a flicker of that violet lantern flame. He reached into his pocket and felt something cold. His heart skipped a beat as he pulled it out. It was a single raw nugget of gold, jagged, heavy, and pulsing with a faint internal warmth. He hadn't picked it up. The mine had planted it on him, a seed of the mountain's greed. "We didn't just bring back memories," Ethan said, his voice a dry rasp. He held the nugget out. Leo recoiled as if it were a live grenade. "Get rid of it, Ethan. Throw it into the woods. We can't keep anything from that place." "It's not just the gold," Chloe said, her voice eerily calm. She was looking at the gas station attendant through the windshield. The man was standing perfectly still behind the counter, staring directly at their truck with a vacant, unblinking expression. "Look at him, look at his eyes." Ethan squinted. Under the harsh fluorescent light, the attendant's eyes weren't human. They were flat black voids like the obsidian chips found in the deep shafts of the Mary Murphy. As they watched, the man tilted his head in a slow, jerky motion, the same puppet-like twitch they had seen in the faceless miner. A sudden violent static erupted from the truck's radio despite the power being off. A voice, distorted and layered with 1,000 whispers, filled the cabin. "The debt is not paid." Panic flared again, a cold, sharp blade in their chests. Ethan slammed the truck into gear and tore out of the gas station, the tires spitting gravel. "We aren't home yet," he shouted over the roar of the engine. "The mountain isn't a place, it's a parasite, it's in our heads." They drove through the night, the landscape of the Colorado high country blurring into a surreal tapestry of shadows and stone. The further they drove from St. Elmo, the more the world seemed to warp. The stars above began to rearrange themselves into the shape of a pickaxe. The moon took on the sickly yellow hue of aged sulfur. By the time they reached the outskirts of Boulder, the sun was beginning to bleed over the horizon, but it provided no comfort. The familiar red-roofed buildings of the university looked like a stage set, thin, fragile, and ready to collapse. They pulled into the deserted parking lot near their dorms. "We stay together," Leo insisted, his voice cracking. "Nobody goes to their room alone." They huddled in Ethan's apartment, the curtains drawn, the lights blazing. But the safety of the indoors was an illusion. Olivia went to the kitchen to get water, but when she turned on the tap, it wasn't water that flowed. It was a thick gray sludge of tailings and crushed rock. She screamed, dropping the glass, which shattered into shards that looked like teeth. "It's happening again," she sobbed, collapsing onto the floor. "It's rewriting everything." Ethan grabbed his camera, the one he thought was broken. He turned it on, and to his horror, the screen showed not the apartment, but the interior of the Mary Murphy mine. The camera was filming them in real time, but in the footage they weren't in a room. They were huddled in a dark, damp cavern, their faces covered in soot. their eyes wide with a madness that surpassed anything they had felt before. In the video, a figure approached them from the darkness. It was Chloe's great-grandfather, his face a weathered map of a century's worth of toil. He reached out a hand, and in the video, he touched Chloe's shoulder. In the apartment, Chloe let out a gasp and slumped forward. On her shoulder, a handprint of white alkaline dust appeared, burning through her jacket like acid. "Enough!" Ethan screamed at the empty air. "Take the gold, take the memories. Just let us go!" He threw the gold nugget across the room. It didn't bounce. It hit the wall and vanished into the drywall like a stone into water. A low-frequency vibration began to shake the building. It wasn't an earthquake, it was the sound of a mountain breathing. Chloe stood up, her eyes glazed and distant. She walked toward the wall where the nugget had disappeared. "He's not asking for the gold, Ethan," she said, her voice sounding like the grinding of tectonic plates. "He's asking for the silence. The mountain is lonely. It hasn't had a new story in 100 years. "We aren't stories," Leo yelled, throwing his recorder against the wall. "To the earth we are just carbon and echoes," Chloe replied. The walls of the apartment began to peel away, revealing the dark, jagged ribs of the mountain beneath the paint. The floor turned into a steep scree slope. They were no longer in Boulder. They were back in the heart of the Mary Murphy, at the very bottom of the lowest shaft, miles beneath the surface of the earth. The faceless miners emerged from the shadows, hundreds of them forming a circle around the 4 students. They didn't attack. They simply stood there, a silent audience to their terror. In the center of the circle stood the man with the violet lantern. He raised the light, and for a moment the darkness was pushed back. In that light, Ethan saw the truth. These weren't ghosts. These were the echoes of everyone who had ever lost themselves to the mountain's promise. Their shadows were etched into the rock, their voices trapped in the vibrations of the stone. "We have to give it a finish," Olivia whispered, her writer's instinct cutting through the fog of her fear. "The story, it's unfinished, that's why it won't let us go." She grabbed a piece of charcoal from the ground and began to write on the rock face. She didn't write about the gold or the miners. She wrote about the 4 of them, about their fear, their friendship, and their refusal to be forgotten. She wrote their names in huge, jagged letters: Ethan, Chloe Del Leo, Olivia. As she finished the last letter, the violet lantern flared with a blinding intensity. The miners let out a collective sigh, a sound of profound relief that echoed through the entire mountain range. The rock walls began to dissolve into mist. Ethan felt a sensation of immense pressure, followed by a sudden jarring snap. He blinked. The sun was hitting his face. He was sitting in the driver's seat of the Raptor. Beside him, Chloe was asleep. In the back, Leo and Olivia were curled up against each other, their breathing steady. He looked around. They were parked in the lot of the Boulder campus. The clock on the dashboard read 8:00 a.m. October 14th. Was it all a dream?" Olivia asked, waking up and rubbing her eyes. Ethan didn't answer. He looked at the camera sitting on the seat. He turned it on. The memory card was empty. No footage of St. Elmo, no footage of the mine. He looked at Leo's recorder. It was blank. They stepped out of the truck, the cool morning air of the foothills feeling like a miracle. They walked toward their dorms, the normalcy of student life. People jogging, the smell of coffee, the sound of distant traffic, feeling like a precious, fragile gift. They had survived. They had returned to their lives, and to anyone else, they were just 4 students returning from a weekend trip. But as Ethan walked toward his building, he stopped. He looked down at the sidewalk. There, etched into the concrete in a way that looked decades old, were 4 names: Ethan, Chloe, Leo, Olivia. He looked back at the mountains, the jagged peaks of the Rockies standing tall and silent against the blue sky. He knew then that they had left a part of themselves behind, a psychological tether that would never truly break. They were alive, they were home, but the mountain had their names. They lived their lives. Ethan became a successful filmmaker, but he never made another documentary. Leo worked in acoustics, but avoided the silence of the wilderness. Olivia wrote novels, but they were always about people lost in places that didn't exist. And Chloe moved back to the mountains, living in a small cabin where she could listen to the wind. They were the ones who came back, the 4 who survived the Mary Murphy. But every year on October 13th, they would all feel a slight tremor in their bones, a low-frequency hum that reminded them of the violet light and the faceless audience. The mountain didn't take their lives, but it had taken their peace, replacing it with the eternal, heavy wisdom of the deep earth. They were free, but they were forever the keepers of St. Elmo's silence. Thanks for sticking around until the end, guys. If you enjoyed this video, smash that like button and hit the bell icon after subscribing to stay tuned. I'd love to hear your thoughts on today's story, so drop a comment below.